song in Beat Detective, whereas it took me 2 hours to do this whole song in Reaper, and it sounds better because I had total manual control over what I considered at the beginning of a transient. Whereas with Beat Detective, I didn't bother going and double checking absolutely everything because it was already taking me an absolutely absurd amount of time to do it. But yeah, anyways, zoom out. Like, those are all the hits I've done so far in this tutorial while talking and trying to explain everything, and it was totally effortless, and I guarantee you this sounds flawless because the end result is exactly what you would get with Beat Detective. You have the hits, move to the grid, a little bit of a pad and a fade. Hit, move to the grid, a pad, and a fade. So most important things to remember are anytime a hit is early, you put the crossfade right before that hit and move it over. Anytime a hit is late, you put the crossfade right before the grid line where you're going to move it to and slide it back. I know with Beat Detective, even just in Pro Tools in general, if I'm not using Beat Detective and I have to fix something manually, a lot of the time you can't really judge exactly where the crossfade needs to be without going back afterwards and doing a little bit of trial and error, moving stuff around. So I can't mimic it in Reaper because Reaper is a totally awful piece of crap software when it comes to trying to move actual regions around. But like, say I had like 2 regions like this, I'll just delete that and move these over. Oh my god, I hate how it automatically crossfades everything. So say like in Pro Tools, I'll turn off auto crossfades, I would slide that over like that to move it on time, and it would overlap the beginning of that transient. In Reaper it doesn't, but that is not the desired behavior. I would prefer if it overlapped, even though I have to fix it. So in Pro Tools now, you would basically crossfade here and then slide the crossfade around until you found where the transient was and get it in the right place. With this method, the slip editing method, that place that you're putting the crossfade in the first place is the only place, it's like the perfect place to place the crossfade before you even start the editing. You already know exactly where it's going to be. Like, because I'm putting this crossfade here, I know that that's where it needs to end up, because if I extend this piece of audio and trim it outwards, I know that's where that transient is going to show up. So when I move this over, like, oh, maybe I can move the crossfade a little earlier and make the change, like the transition, less awkward or less shitty sounding. So I'll slide it over. Oh shit. Fucking Reaper. Maybe I have to have them both selected. I don't know. Either way, it's not behaving the way I expected. But say maybe I need auto crossfades on for that to work. Yeah, see, that's stupid. But okay, so you slide this over to try and get it close to the transient, but if you zoom in and look, now you're revealing that transient from under there, so you're going to have a double hit going on. It's going to sound stupid. So because you know in the first place that the transient is right there, and that's where you've placed the crossfade to move it, you don't have to go back and fine-tune the position of the crossfade ever, because you know that's exactly where it needs to be. So it's just split drag, split drag, split drag, split drag until you're going through the whole song. And I guarantee you, like in a simple 4-minute rock song, this would take me like half an hour. Whereas it would still take me like probably an hour and 15 minutes in Beat Detective. Like, this ridiculously technical death metal only took 2 hours in Pro Tools, whereas it took almost 9 hours in Beat Detective. Like, this is all like 16th note blasts where the snares on the E and A of all the beats. So in Pro Tools or Beat Detective, I would have to set Beat Detective to be looking for 16th notes, even though really, like, since I'm usually editing kick and the rest of the kit separately, and I usually don't bother editing cymbal transients, especially on something like a blast where it's all 16th notes, because you're going to end up with a lot of artifacts when you're doing that many tiny chops that close together. So with a blast like that, like the snares are technically on 16th notes, but they're all spaced out as 8th notes. But I can't set Beat Detective to snap it to 8ths because otherwise it'll put it on the beat. So I have to set it to snap to 16th notes, which gives me double the amount of grid lines for it to accidentally snap to that aren't the right beats to snap it to. So I don't know. I find this way to be so much simpler. Like I've said before, you know, split, drag, split, drag, split, drag, split, drag. It's I hear people say stuff about this method like it's not as accurate as Beat Detective because you're eyeballing it instead of snapping it, like the regions to the grid. But like Beat Detective isn't a human being anyways. Beat Detective is trying to figure out where the transient is and then snapping what it's decided to be the transient to the grid. Whereas I myself can look and say, I know that the transient is there and snap it to the grid. It's not snapped, but it's right on the grid. Like the tolerance where Pro Tools is calculating where the trigger point is just as big of a tolerance as whether my hit is exactly on the grid or not. And like this is what between this line and this line is like 63 milliseconds, and that looks pretty on to me. So it's going to sound absolutely dead on to the grid machine, like unreal tight. So don't stress out about, oh, I'm not actually snapping it, I'm dragging it in slip mode, eyeballing it to the grid, because it's snapping it at least as close as any quantized process is going to snap it. And this way you have absolute manual fine control over everything. And to me, it makes way more sense, and it's way less frustrating than Beat Detective where you're hoping it does everything automatically. But yeah, I don't know, give it a shot. Like, I love Beat Detective for automatic stuff and when you're doing simpler stuff. And I'll probably still continue to use it like for a few things in Pro Tools. But ironically, most of the time I'm going to be coming back to Reaper to do my drum editing and doing all my tracking and mixing in Pro Tools, whereas everyone else would probably do it the other way around. Beat Detective is still useful for stuff like chopping up guitars that were played at like half speed to quantize them to grid and stuff like that. But for actually editing drums, I find this to be way, way, way easier. Anyways, check it out. Hopefully you get some use out of it. Thank Joey for this. It's probably the coolest drum editing method I've ever heard of, and I wish I came up with it because it totally stomps over everything else. Cool.